back everywhere, because at the end of the day, people, and I just can't see how you can keep the healthcare system functioning without this preventative measure. It's possible that people will say, well, now that we have a pill, I don't need to do that. But we still don't know exactly how that pans out in terms of these high efficacy numbers. So,
Sam, where are we, in the UK and the US in terms of level of infections and also booster shots? So does a booster shot significantly cut down, the possibility that someone ends up in hospital?
Yes, and it also cuts down the risk of catching an infection, at least in the near term. That's what Israel data is showing us. And where we are with boosters, I think the UK is doing really well, relatively speaking. And that's where both, at least the UK case counts are coming down quite nicely. And the US has come down and now stalled.
Sam, anything else that you're watching in the UK, and whether that's a metric or whether you're looking at elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'm definitely keeping an eye on. One is I'm looking forward to Sanofi giving us data for their antigen-based vaccine, because that's going to be adding a lot of volume into the next year, and that should come in the next couple of months.
Presently there of Bloomberg Intelligence. Now, coming up, Obama grabs the summit spotlight at COP26. We're in Glasgow with all of the details next. This is Bloomberg.
Its top spot as Asia's busiest airport in 2020 when passenger traffic slumped 88% from 2019. The lack of a domestic market and strict COVID rules have made for a slow recovery in areas where you would typically see throngs of passengers waiting to board their flights to destinations across the world. Only 2 lounges do remain open to travelers, one operated by the...
When COVID had hit, we had closed a lot of our lounges and airport hospitality services. We're cautiously optimistic with the growth.
COVID certainly has forced a rethink of strategy to be nimble in the face of policy uncertainty during the pandemic era.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video.
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
We are nowhere near where we need to be yet. 6 years ago.
Well, that was former President Barack Obama imploring nations to work together to fight climate change. Now, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg Green reporter Jess Schenkelman in Glasgow. Jess, first of all, you've been doing some fantastic work. There's a great newsletter, which I urge everyone to. Energy Day. These thematic days are supposed to bring awareness to climate issues. Is it working, Jess?
Yeah, as you say, Francine, you were here last week. There was all these huge announcements from governments on things like ending deforestation or ending coal in the UK, but that was an allocation of already pre-announced money. So what we're seeing now is there's a real change of pace here, and we're focusing on the negotiations. And there's questions about how countries are going to agree to a global carbon market, how they're going to keep 1.5 alive, which is Alok Sharma, the COP
degrees Celsius alive.
Yeah, so when the energy ministers arrive, this is when it starts to get political, and we're going to start to see the positions of different governments start to clarify, because last week we just had the officials in the rooms who come here with a negotiating piece of paper, what they can do, and they can't adaptation fund from global carbon markets, whether they can on 1.5, you know, how exactly, the question is how are they going to keep that promise alive, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees? But what are they actually going to do? One of the calls from vulnerable countries is to say countries have to come back every single year to have new climate pledges. But some countries are saying that's just too onerous. It takes them a year and a half to come up with a climate pledge and get that through government. So they can't be expected to come back every year.
Yeah. Jess, what else are you watching for the rest of the week?
They've been trying to get countries to sign up to. I'm interested in whether the UK is going to sign up to that, because the UK is really making a play on being unashamedly ambitious and proactive on climate change. So if it doesn't sign up, that's going to be a big question. And then I'm also interested in whether the COP talks are going to finish on Friday. The UK government is saying this year, after 13 years of them going over time, this year it's going to finish. In a way, it might be quite a bad sign if it finishes on time, because it shows that countries haven't really got...
You know, everyone is. Jess, so what are we expecting at the end of it, actually? Is there going to be some, you know, a signed declaration from the member countries that were there, or how does it actually work? Do we know yet?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is it's not going to be an accord like the Paris Accord. It's not going to be a protocol like the Kyoto Protocol. What should we actually call this agreement? And I was asking yesterday, is it going to be legally binding? They say it's going to have legal standing, but it won't be legally binding. And I think the concern is from poor and vulnerable countries is that this might end up being quite a weak agreement, something like a G20 text where countries promise to do stuff, but it never really necessarily gets followed up on. And I think that's really all being thrashed out at the moment as these energy...
Bloomberg Green reporter there, Jess Schenkelman in Glasgow. Now, this is what the picture looks like for the markets. We're seeing a bit of a reversal and actually a bit of support across the board on equities. Coming up shortly, we'll have plenty more on Bloomberg Surveillance. Early edition, we look at not only Bitcoin, but we'll look at, of course, Lil Brainard and the Fed. This is Bloomberg.
When you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Do you see Deutsche Bank ready to pay more and pay out more in terms of bonuses too for staff to have that strong talent that I'm sure you want?
Well, look, it's a war for talent. It has been, you know, in other cycles before. It is now. We're finding that we're competitive in that war for talent.
The difference that we did not anticipate is the depth and the breadth of the global supply shock. Adverse supply shocks, you know, are a fact of life for monetary policy. It's been a while.
We are nowhere near where we need to be yet. For starters, despite the progress that Paris represented, most countries have failed to meet the action plans that they set 6 years ago.
Crypto is going to be the future of the fintech industry, and to be honest, it's going to be...
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what for the job. The Fed sounds the alarm on risky assets, flagging concerns about stablecoins and Chinese real estate. That's as the nation's bond sells off, sparking worry. The bank is confident that the current higher inflation is transitory. Philip Blaine says it would be counterproductive to tighten policy now. So first thing is first, at top of the 9 UK time, we always check the markets. We started actually on the lower side, and today, just moments ago, we had a bit of a reversal with the European Stock 600, now pretty much flat. Now, some of the other things that we're watching, we did see a reversal when it comes to some of the Treasury repricing. This is on the back of markets thinking that actually Lael Brainard, well, maybe not a lot more, but more dovish. Short-term maturity are leading gains in Treasuries following this report that the U.S. president interviewed Lael Brainard. The other story we're watching out for, of course, is crude oil. We're expecting a lot of energy ministers to show up in Glasgow for COP26. We'll see whether they give us an indication on where they expect the price of oil. Does it go to 100, as some investors are saying? That will be huge for the economy and, of course, inflationary pressures. And then finally, Bitcoin, 68,095. Anything above 68,000 means that it's a new record, and we touched that. Overall, the value of Bitcoin, I think, is at 3, which is possibly why over the CAC 40 in France, but also Switzerland with Richemont is pretty much flat. And then you can see the UK gaining some 0.1%. But after gains in the energy sector yesterday, things are pretty much flat across the board. So now let's get more on the Fed. Let's get a lot more on Lael Brainard. It's a Bloomberg scoop. The Fed governor, Lael Brainard, was interviewed for the Fed's top job last week when she visited the White House. That's early next year. Well, joining us now is Simon Kennedy. Simon, I'm so happy to see you. The Bloomberg executive editor for economics. We wheel out the big guns when it's a big story like this. So what are Simon Brainard's chances of taking the top spot?
Oh, I think you put it correctly. If he doesn't go with Jerome Powell, he'll probably go with Lael Brainard. Those are the two the runners that have been most frequently mentioned. And there are upsides and downsides, as with any big choice. Perhaps the main challenge for Lael Brainard is whether she can get through the Senate. Remember, the Senate's split between the Democrats and the Republicans, although the vice president has the deciding vote, whereas Jerome Powell would get an easier walk through the Senate. He's been confirmed to that Joe Biden has to make. And when you look at them from a monetary policy perspective, Jerome Powell and Lael Brainard quite similar. They've both played a big role in this.
When you look at the impact that it could have, I mean, would she be much more dovish? And actually, President Biden really has a chance to reshape the whole Fed because there are so many vacancies coming up.
Yeah, and you saw another vacancy open up yesterday with Randall Quaz resigning. He's already stepped down as the vice chair for supervision. One of the chess games you can play is you put Jerome Powell in as a second term as chairman, and you ask Lael Brainard to replace Randy Quaz as the vice chair for supervision. That gives a nod to the Democratic base that wants someone tougher on banks. Lael Brainard's perhaps a bit more fine favor with the Democratic base. And then you have 2 and in a short term 3 slots on the Fed board where people of color, the diversity of the Fed has been pretty poor in its 100 years. And so this is a great opportunity for President Biden to bow to that.
Simon, is there any worry in the markets that actually they're dealing with something pretty big, which is trying to understand whether inflation is transitory or not? And so a change at the top would lead to uncertainty, make that much of a difference?
Yeah, I think Lael Brainard's a known quantity. She's been at the Fed since 2014. Before that, she spent a long time in the Treasury Department. So she's pretty well known. She's a PhD economist. And so there's not much change in monetary policy, although there would be a surprise given that be asked, is she on board with the strategy that he unveiled last year? Again, she helped co-author it, so there'd probably be some sense that continues. So on monetary policy.
Kennedy there, Bloomberg's executive editor for economics. Of course, he'll stay on top of this and everything else. We have some great Bloomberg coverage. You should also sign up to Simon's newsletter with his and his team, Barclays, for a robust conversation on inflation, transitory or not. Sylvia, as always, thank you so much for joining us, especially here on set. I think it's the first time I see you here, so welcome to Bloomberg headquarters in Europe. When you look at some of the things that we need to figure out, inflation, transitory or not, and also what does inflation...
That person, thank you for having me, Francine.
what we are looking at, I think the main key driver that we are looking at right now are wages. Wages seems to be the inflation to persist much longer than the next year. And when we look at the euro area, we think that it's really premature to think that have healed beautifully, I would say, so far. But still, there is about 1.5% of the labor force on furlough schemes. Hours worked are not at the level that they were pre-pandemic, and the labor force participation rate has dropped. So there are margins through which labor supply can be increased before raising wages. And second, the wage negotiations in the euro area are staggered and take up through time. So far, we have even had wage decline in Q2.
But, so when you look at the Bank of England, and this is a big thing that really surprised us a lot, enough drivers, gas prices going up, that's very domestic. If they're not raising interest rates, does it mean that the Fed has to go first? Or talk to us about the dynamics there.
Look, the forecast that we have is that indeed the Bank of England will go first with a very moderate cycle. We expect a 15 basis. Yes, we have maybe a bit less conviction that we had last week, but the call was the same. We haven't changed it. On the Fed, instead, we think that they will taper, they will end 2023.
Is that a policy mistake if they don't start? I know we're looking at the dynamics, but is it worse to start hiking a tiny bit and see also what the market does than wait too long and we actually have inflation that's sticky and stays?
Look, again, I think the difference stays in whether you think that inflation will stick or stay or not, and gradually decline, and we will not feed into second-round effects. So we don't talk about policy mistakes if they wait and they hike later on. We think that there is still enough.
And you explained beautifully the difference, in wage pressure, because of course it's very difficult. It's very difficult to give someone a raise and then take it out, which means that it wouldn't be transitory. Being able to find the suitable employees to hire. How much does that weigh in?
Well, there is definitely in some countries, but others, I think we think it's temporary too, because it has been driven by the pandemic. I think going to the wage growth, you are totally right. It's very difficult to take it back.
Right.
But the issue is, you have to distinguish between a one-off increase in the level and the growth rate, and whether this growth rate will be then persistently keep going higher. So I don't know. The chief economist of the ECB has made it clear. If we have a one-off increase in wage growth, wages were growing at 1.5%, and they were to grow at 2.5% for a year or so. That compensate for past would be the kind of second-round effects.
All right, Silvia, thanks so much. Silvia Ardegna there, from Head of European Economics Research at Barclays, stays with us. We'll talk also a little bit about energy pressures. Now, coming up over at the ECB, Christine Lagarde says the central bank is confident that current higher inflation is transitory, while Philip Lane says it would be counterproductive to... Is there at the moment amongst the asset managers that actually some of the ESG labeled products, then if you probe
about ESG labels or sustainable labels, and that again is one of the reasons we're having this ruthless, relentless focus on net zero, because in the end, look, we can't stabilize the climate unless we get to net zero, and it's a simple, these are hard numbers. Your emissions are either A or B, they're going up or down, and if they're going down, are they going down consistent with the science? We anchor it in the science, the same science the UN and others use. These are great questions. So let's look at what happened with TCFD, climate disclosure. 6 years ago, you and I were in Paris, we talked about this, we talked of other things. Now that's moving to become mandatory.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring.
The could be some hiccups in financial markets. We see a lot of leverage, concentration risk, exposure to still be alert and focus very much on credit risk.
Well, that was the ECB Supervisory Board Chair, Andrea Enria, on the state of financial markets. Let's get back to Silvia Ardagna, Head of European Economics Research at Barclays. Silvia, we talked a little bit about some of these inflationary pressures, the fact that you're expecting for them to be transitory, much like the chief economist of the ECB is saying. What do you do with energy right now? If we have oil at $100, what happens to the recovery?
Well, definitely it's a risk to European consumers because we import energy and so real disposable income will go down. So this will help them weathering this shock. In addition, we have seen governments already taking measures to try to ease the pressures on low-income households. So overall, we think that this is a risk, is not a baseline that the outlook will be basically derailed by the energy shock.
So when you look at Europe, is there anything that actually makes you uneasy? I know we talked a lot about inflation. We talked a little bit about what a policy mistake could look like. Is there something that the market is not focused on from an economic point of view that it should be focused on?
Well, look, cases are up. So pandemic, COVID cases are up throughout Europe. We have seen governments taking measures to try to limit, mobility restriction of unvaccinated persons. Some restriction will have to be put in place. Obviously, supply-side bottlenecks are constraining industrial production. We have seen that when supply bottlenecks eased again, there will be a catch-up.
From a broader point of view, just oil infrastructure in general, but some of the old energy without being quite ready to face the new world. And so he says this future shocks to come.
Look, it is possibility. It's always very difficult to forecast shocks. Yes. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such, right? But definitely the transition to the greening economy, we are learning through it. It will have, consequences. I think in Europe, we are very committed losers from this transition. So hopefully, yes, maybe we will have a more volatile environment, but we also have resources that can help us weathering this transition.
Unless China changes its no-zero COVID tolerance policy, what does it mean for ports and the impact that it has on European companies?
Yeah, definitely. This is one big risk that we are factoring in part in our forecast. We have seen China already slowing quite significantly for many different reasons, one of which is the zero tolerance, as you said. And there are casing up once again in China. So clearly...
This instability report, of course, from the Fed, they mentioned, for example, cryptocurrency instability that could see there, some instability in the markets, and they also mentioned these property developers in China. Is anything...
Systemic risk, we are more concerned about the fact that this is obviously an important sector in China, and so a slowdown in this sector slows down China growth in general, and then it affects Europe through the export channel.
Silvia, thank you so much for joining us today. Silvia Ardagna, their Head of European Economics Research at Barclays, joining us from the studio. Now, coming up, oil up for a third day. That's as traders wait for further signals from the U.S. on whether it will tap crude reserves. That story is up next, and this is...
The past 18 months have reminded us how essential the PC is to work, life, learning, and connecting. And with Windows 11, we have renewed sense of the role Windows plays in the world. It all
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archive.
Over the past few weeks, it's made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Surveillance early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Denmark, which is one of Europe's highest vaccination rates, plans to reintroduce some restrictions to halt a recent spike in COVID-19 cases. Danes will have to again present so-called coronavirus passports to attend restaurants, nightclubs and other public events. Daily infections in the country have more than doubled in the past 2 weeks as a number of European nations battle another wave of the virus. Now, Hong Kong may not open up, open borders with the mainland first. Hong Kong and China remain the only places left in the world still pursuing that COVID-0 strategy. Singapore, meanwhile, is easing some tough COVID measures put in place more than a month ago, with up to 5 people from the same residence now allowed to dine in restaurants together. The Fed is warning that risky asset prices keep rising. Investor sentiment or setbacks in containing the pandemic would make asset prices vulnerable to significant declines. It lists threats. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Now, oil rising for a third day. That's as traders wait for further signals from the White House on whether it will tap reserves, possibly coordinating a release of crude with other nations. Well, joining us now is Will Kennedy, our energy and commodities executive editor. Will, I have like 1,000,001 questions, including, will, the U.S. finally pulled the trigger on some of these stockpiles, but actually the bigger question is, how much higher can the price of oil go? That little easy question to start us off.
He's signaled last week and the rest of OPEC Plus that they're going to keep a very tight rein on supply from other parts of the world because of the lack of investment and because shale isn't responding to these higher prices so far, is constrained. It's a pretty bullish mix, especially when there's every reason to think that oil could go higher from here, especially if it gets very cold in the Northern Hemisphere.
Today it's steadying somewhat. Are they actually expecting...
And this anticipation that the US may do something and release reserves. There are hints that they're considering that. I don't think it's a done deal. They would probably like to do it internationally with some partners. That's going to be difficult to arrange. So traders are really in a wait-and-see mode on that.
I mean, Joe Biden and other countries have just asked, let's say, like some analysts say, that, the price of oil goes to 100. What does that mean for the demand? What does that mean for the recovery overall?
Yeah, I think higher oil prices are a key concern for higher oil prices hurt. We had a story today about how truck drivers in parts of Asia are on strike because it's so expensive for them to drive. The president is very aware of that pain. He would like to get on top of it. The question is, does an SPR release actually bring down prices, or does it just do it in the short term? If you do it once, are you going to do it again? It's not a policy without downsides.
Yep. Will, thank you so much. Certainly it will keep us entertained, and it will keep our Will Kennedy busy, our energy and commodities executive editor. Coming up, Virginie Morgon, chief executive of Eurazeo, one of Europe's leading private equity players. We'll talk green. This is Bloomberg.
Han profundizado el extractivismo en Argentina con más agronegocio, un proyecto de ley que es la ley de hidrocarburos.
Radio.
We are on the verge of a disaster.
Join us live from Glasgow. Speak with global leaders, keep you up to date on progress and setbacks, and analyze what it all means to you.
We're going to need to see some real action.
COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, this week on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
In crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative.
Well, here are your top stories today. The Fed sounds the alarm on risky assets, flagging concerns about stablecoins and Chinese real estate. That sounds the nation's bonds sell-off. Spark is confident that the current higher inflation is transitory. Philip Lane says it would be counterproductive to tighten policy now. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the focus firmly on the markets. We did see a reversal in the last, I would say, hour or so. Now, we started the day off with a bit of pressure, downside pressure, mainly looking at what's happening at the Fed, maybe pricing in a bit of energy costs that could lead to higher inflation. Again, this has been the big story driving the markets over the last couple of weeks. Shorter maturity, for example, at gains in treasuries, and overall U.S. futures are little changed, but we're seeing a bit of an upside to Europe, and then we closely keep an eye on Bitcoin, 67,900 funded. Oaseo is one of Europe's leading private equity companies. Its chief executive officer, Virginie Morgon, wants more and has ambitious plans, who joins us live from Paris now. Virginie, thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedule to speak to Bloomberg. When you look at some of the opportunities out there for private equity companies.
Good morning, Francine. Very nice to be with you this morning. So listen, if you allow me, let's start with I'm told that we have 9 years. 9 years to make the most important decision in order to reach our... So I see it, Francine, as two missions. The first mission is to bridge the gaps and accelerate that bridging. We have a GDP gap. 30, the low carbon economy, that's the start, is invested per year. We need to go to 4 or 5 trillion per year in order to hope to reach the 1.5. As an investor, technology gap, we need to invest in hydrogen, direct carbon capture. We spend a lot of time concentrating on supply. It is now time to focus on reducing demand. So that's, I think, the first critical mission. And in that mission, Francine, we as private equity players can play a very important role.
Virginie, and we'll get to some of the sectors or some of the value proposition that you're seeing in sustainability, but I was in Glasgow last week, and a lot of the focus, of course, was on exactly what you were saying. Green assets, and yet emissions go up. So until finance, private equities, but also big banks, have a significant reallocation of capital.
So out of the $30 billion that we manage, already 20% of our assets under management are being invested, allocated to a low carbon and inclusive economy. Let's not forget, we have two very important pillars, low carbon and inclusivity and diversity, about 20%. I think the key to your question, Francine, is about not just investing in energy transition, digital transition. The latest fund that we are launching, the Maritime Fund, is about energy. First, it's extremely highly inflationary, so creates other problems that we will have to deal with in terms of prices of the assets. And we're only dealing with a small portion of the GDP. So transition is what matters. And yes, you're right, there are some sectors which are excluded. What we as private equity investors should do, we don't invest in oil and gas, for example.
So, Virginie, you talked about the Sustainable Maritime Infrastructure Fund. You also have another Sustainable Infrastructure Fund and Smart City 2. What's the right way to allocate capital in these? If you look at, for example, how cities work, and maybe you can see the biggest difference on sustainability at city level, what are you invested in?
Of living, in a bright real estate, energy transition, measuring every consumption in our daily life, from real estate to mobility to digitalization to cloud. So it's a very large span, AR, virtual, the new, metaverse trends with our latest investment in like Neo4j or in SoRare. So we go all the way across that continuum. As a CEO of a global private equity, which has really embarked into ESG for the last 2 decades, would be, there's no investment that we make where I don't have an ESG plan of transformation and extra financial KPIs that we follow on a regular basis. So it's about ambition, it's about measurement, it's about transparency.
How has actually what we've seen with the pandemic changed the trajectory? So has it accelerated some of the trends that you were just talking about, or has it actually changed them and brought more challenges overall, I guess, for the world, and therefore maybe more opportunities for private equity firms?
You're very right. There has been, and that's a good thing. It pleases me as a CEO. So that's a great thing. What do we see? A complete pivoting of all our businesses to digital, and a very much embedded new awareness of environment. And so not about now this awakening and this trust that CEOs have that we have to make the change, that we as leaders have to build a better future. The issue and the danger is the execution. Execution is in everyday diligence for every investment that we make, Francine. And then we have, for every investment that we have in private equity, a plan of transformation. Could be supply chain. This is about ESG. And that's where we will make the difference in order to reach that ambition of a 1.5,
Companies holding on to portfolio companies a lot more. Is it the same as Eurazeo, and is this to grow the companies a lot more to critical level? And do you think this is an industry-wide trend?
There is an industry-wide trend, but you targeting being climate neutral, net carbon zero by 2035 is a very technical and a high level of expertise is needed in your own team in order to achieve that target. So that's the first comment. The second comment are active funds, which are either Article 8 or Article 9, which is, as you know, the highest standard of the European disclosure framework. That's the consequence of the last 20 years of commitment and dedication that we as a private equity investor have injected in the way we invest. So it has to be taken in account very seriously that this level of expertise takes
time today. Virginie Morgon there, the Chief Executive Officer of Eurazeo, joining us from Paris. Now coming up, we take our weekly look at life after LIBOR as the expiration of the benchmark.
And click on it, we make money. But now there's a big difference compared to other search engines. We use the money to plant trees all over the world where they are needed most.
So do you enjoy being a senator with all this pressure on you? Is this fun, or is it not that much fun?
My dad always said, if you can say no with a tear in your eye, you might be okay. And I've been crying a lot lately.
most financial institutions should be, or most institutions or organizations should be looking at crypto at this stage. Crypto is going to be the future of the fintech industry, and to be honest, it's going to be the future of money. So anybody who doesn't understand money is going to be at a significant disadvantage as the institution. They should be looking at this now. Development of ETFs is a very positive thing. They can typically reach customers that we were not able to, as traditional investors in the stock markets, that we so far have not been able to reach. And having those guys bringing those people into crypto is a huge win for the industry. I think right now the crypto industry is only about 5% penetration globally. So out of 8 billion people, probably only around 400 million people have crypto. It's already large, it's being saturated a little bit. And then there may be some competition, but right now we're like on virgin territory. So there's really no overlap. The more people that we can bring together into the crypto industry, the better it is for everyone in the industry. So, and even when the markets reach 95%, there's always new applications that can be built. So I never have the finite mindset of where it's a finite market. The market is infinite. The more applications we can build, the more products.
There's a new initiative actually by Binance to support some of the cryptocurrencies in France and in Europe in general, and this is through money. Where does Europe stand in the crypto universe compared to Asia and the US?
Is mostly servicing everywhere else, servicing the international communities. So we do view Europe as Europe is a very large market. Europe has always been an early adopter in crypto. Switzerland, Zug, France, etc. And we view France as a very strategic position for us. And the regulators are extremely pro innovation, and they're very tough, but they're pro innovation. So we want to, and the local talent in France is quite strong. So we want France typically had a very strong mathematics and also engineering background. So we want to leverage that and grow the community, help to grow the community in France, and also in new technology who's not following is going to be at a disadvantage. And I think he's obviously extremely smart, and he's embracing the new innovations, which is great. And New York has always been a financial leader globally, and it's just great to see that.
Well, that was the Binance chief executive, CZ, speaking on the program yesterday. Now, in the meantime, this is what we're seeing for Bitcoin. Bitcoin and Ether both actually hitting records amid this broad rally in cryptocurrencies. If you look at, what these virtual currencies are rallying on, it's often a pretty difficult task, but some theories pointed to the appetite for just a side note, actually up more than 130% this year. Ether up some 550%, though critics, of course, for the volatility dollars of contracts, including mortgages and business loans from legal chaos when the LIBOR benchmark expires. And that's what we are looking at today in our bi-weekly look at life after LIBOR. Well, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg editor Will Shaw. Will, great to have you on the program today. So what is the concern about these consumer contracts when,
at this stage, but you've still got this rump of about $16 trillion that aren't going to be worth of contracts that aren't going to be able to transition. And also, it's very difficult in some cases for lenders to get consent from the borrowers to switch them over to new rates.
So what is
several senators that are also looking into the problem.
So how likely is it that actually gets resolved in time?
Well, an important point to make is that Bloomberg Intelligence estimates that there might be a legislative solution as soon as early December. But I think what's worth pointing, people were expecting to get it passed, and it took longer than people thought it would. Now, if you take that question to Washington, you've got various differing personalities this might pass.
Well, thank you so much, Will Shaw there, looking at LIBOR. Now, a disclaimer, the Bloomberg Short-Term Bank Yield Index, BSBY, or an alternative to SOFR for dollar LIBOR, is also administered by a subsidiary of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News. Now, coming up, property contagion. The bond sell-off spreads to China's entire real estate sector. We look into that story next. This is Bloomberg.
that does not mean that we should be naive in the way that we look at our all legitimate concerns that any government, many other governments around the world have. But I expect there are lots of. Look, China is a great country and civilization.
What about wind power? Would you let them buy offshore wind power? That's infrastructure.
I think you.
I was just finishing what you were saying, Tom. November 3rd is when the decision is. Just in case people got confused, I will. Just one more story, Tom.
Yeah, thank God for that.
We're at 137 right now. Into weakness. Is this where they play the music and the Academy Awards? Is this it? Do I thank my mum again? You know who's in charge here.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
It's a double-edged situation. On the one hand side, we have to ensure that CO2 emissions are going down, which is mainly done by taxing CO2 emissions, which means, of course, increasing prices on energy at the moment, on fossil fuels, for example. So to a certain extent, states are driving those costs. On the other hand side, we have to ensure that people can afford heating in winter, for example. When I take a look over the European development of energy prices, I can see that in some countries like Spain or France, for example, where there is still a highly regulated energy market, the price rising is one of the heaviest. In Austria, it's rising, but it's not a big problem at the moment. What we have done is to also implement in a CO2 pricing scheme an inflation break, meaning that if meant the full increase of CO2 pricing for the next year. But also, if energy prices are falling, we will increase the CO2 pricing, so to make sure that there is some kind of an inflation break on energy prices.
That was the Austrian Finance Minister, Gernot Blumel, speaking to my colleague Alex Steele. Now, just weeks ago, Wall Street analysts and central bankers were quick to assure investors that a collapse by China Evergrande Group wouldn't be a Lehman moment. Now that a bond sell-off has spread to China's entire real estate sector and beyond, there's concern is growing about the potential risk to the global financial system. Well, joining us now is Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, our China credit reporter. Rebecca, thank you for making the time to come on today. So are we seeing signs of contagion in China's broader credit market?
Absolutely. I mean, what started off as this sell-off in China high yield, where, to its higher-rated property developers, so firms like Country Garden and Vanke, China's two largest property developers, and it's now going beyond that, spreading into the broader market for Chinese investment-grade dollar bonds. Now, I think that's what's really worrying, because that actually dominates the $870 billion market for Chinese offshore debt. It makes up about sort of nearly 70% of that is investment-grade quality debt. And if we start to see this sort of indiscriminate selling of bonds, like sold by tech firms, sold by kind of benchmark financial names, that will be really worrying.
So Rebecca, what's next for Evergrande, and what other key Chinese property firms are investors actually watching now?
148 million in coupons that it needs to pay off by the end of a grace period that comes tomorrow if it wants to avoid default. Now, we're potentially outside of Evergrande, investors are really looking at firms like Kaiser, which have an extraordinary amount of offshore dollar debt, about 11 billion, more than half of Evergrande, as well as sort of some of these stronger Chinese property firms, to see whether firms like Yango, which just a few months ago it was impossible to believe that a firm like that would be facing default risk, are looking now to extend their dollar bonds by Friday.
Rebecca, thanks so much. Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, our China credit reporter. Now, this is what the markets are looking at. Overall, there's a little bit of downward pressure that was lifted in the last hour or so. Look at Bitcoin nearing a record high. The repricing of treasuries is quite significant, if I can get my words out. Now, this is treasuries really climbing on some of the speculation that we had with the Fed. Short maturities, actually, central bank's top job. So we'll have plenty more on that throughout the day. Bloomberg surveillance continues in the next hour. This is Bloomberg.
короткие сроки. Это на самом деле эксперимент. Поэтому мне не хочется употреблять такие слова, как страх, боязнь и все прочее. Мне хочется говорить, что это очень вообще там были. А у нас есть возможность полететь в космос, и не просто полететь в космос, а сделать там то, что мы умеем по-настоящему хорошо делать на Земле. Это снять кино.
Вот в чем дело-то. У нас же экспериментальный во многом этот проект. Поэтому мы сейчас столкнемся с кинематографическими нюансами, которые мы могли предвидеть отчасти, какие-то, наверное, не могли предвидеть. То есть, несмотря даже на то, что, опять же, все делились с нами там космическим опытом и так далее. Но это...
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean?
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
The difference that we global supply shock.
We are nowhere near where we need to be yet. For starters, despite the progress that Paris represented,
we will need again fiscal space to help companies and people.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kayleigh Lyons.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 6 p.m. if the economy turns sour and calls stablecoins an emerging threat. A serious rival for Fed Chair Jerome Powell, President Biden interviews Lael Brainard for the top job at the central bank. Maybe due to investors hedging risks from inflation. Good morning, everybody. Good morning from London. I'm Anna Edwards here in London with Matt Miller and Lisa Abramovitz in New York. Kayleigh Lyons is off for this week, so welcome to Lisa. And Matt, in terms of where we are on these markets, it seems that equity markets sort of caught in a holding pattern waiting for the Fed.
Yeah, and a little fear about what's going on in China as well, right? So with equity markets, we have not a lot of action. Chinese markets are, for the most part, gaining. The rest of Asia, for the most part, down. This is the GMM, the Global Macro Movers screen. You can see different assets in different columns here, and equity index are right there at the beginning. So you see most Asian equity indexes down. What you don't see there are the Chinese. See here sovereign bonds. We see some buying in Asia and yields as a result dropping. And we really see that across U.S. assets, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. The interesting thing isn't, though, the government bonds. It's the corporate listeners on Bloomberg Radio, and tell you what we're seeing is we had a huge spike in yields of dollar-denominated debt right at the beginning of the pandemic. That calmed down and was pushed up a little bit by the Evergrande worry. Then everyone said, don't worry about that. The Chinese said it was contained, even though it's yesterday, and we can see that these yields are coming back up again. We just talked to Rebecca Chung-Wilkins with Francine, and she said there's some dollar-denominated bonds that you wouldn't have feared, and today investors are fearing pretty much everything with a dollar sign in front of it that's issued by a Chinese company. Let's take a look at what's going on in U.S. markets. We do see S&P futures rising again, but very little gains. So we're looking for PPI later today. We're looking for CPI tomorrow. And before we get those inflation indicators, investors may want to sit on their hands. We do see yields coming down. As I said, investors are buying debt. 146 sold the debt that's already issued. NYMEX crude up 84 cents. We're going to talk about oil and gas prices as well throughout the program. And then Bitcoin. Anna, as you were mentioning, at one point yesterday, 68,500. So that's the highest we've ever been for Bitcoin. Ether also hit. Yes?
We will get analysis, won't we, on the Bitcoin story, on the cryptocurrency story, Matt, shortly. I just wanted to bring you the data. I know you've been out of Germany a few days now, but probably still watching the German economic story. the ZEW indicator, the German November investor expectations indicator, rising as quite a welcome sign. Let me move on and show you where we are on the European equity market picture right now. And we're seeing quite muted colours coming through on this map. And that is, of course, the result. We are fairly range-bound here in the UK. You can see almost entirely flat, the CAC and the DAX. Slight moves bias to the upside. Let's show you where we are on the individual assets of pools for the UK in here. 196, 197 or so is where we trade, pounds per therm this is. I just wanted to point out that we were as high as around 300 at the height of the gas issues for Europe. We're still at elevated levels versus where we normally are for this time of year, but worth pointing out we are still seeing volatility almost on a daily basis. About Associated British Foods, this, despite the name, also has a clothing retailer under its wing. 6.6% to the upside for that particular UK retailer, rolling out further bricks and mortar stores, which I just thought was worth a mention, and also a special dividend. That's sending the share price higher. Bayer over in Germany up by 3%. Numbers from Bayer today, the stock up by 2.9%. Lisa.
Thank you so much. And I will say that we can head over to John Farrow to get some commentary. He has some pretty strong views. You see the divergence moving pretty steeply between the U.S. and Europe. At 8 a.m., New York time, ECB President Christine Lagarde gives opening remarks on are we going to get the highest read going back to at least 2010 as we continue to see some of those inflationary pressures. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell makes opening remarks at a virtual conference on diversity and energy outlook. This, of course, is key when it comes to deciding whether or not we get some sort of release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We've been hearing Governor Lael Brainerd for the top job at the central bank. Yet another sign that Fed Chair Jerome Powell has a serious rival. We saw a reaction in bond markets. Joe Matthew, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, joined changing the guard at the helm of the Fed.
Well, formally, very little. The White House doesn't like talking about this at all, even after the Randall Quarles announcement yesterday. Is a matter of great importance to President Biden, and an announcement would be forthcoming, and we do expect some sort of announcement by Thanksgiving from this president as he considers things here. But, you know, look, it shouldn't be a major surprise the president interviewed Brainerd. She's the only Democrat on the board, Obama appointed, and has a lot to say. And we know, of course, that she's preferred by progressives, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, who refers to Jay Powell as actually maintain continuity by keeping his preferred candidate, Jay Powell, at the top and elevating Brainerd into this new enforcement role that Quarles will be vacating. I would qualify this Federal Reserve not just by adding more Democrats, but more women and people of color.
It is interesting to think of Jay Powell as a dangerous man. That I could ruminate on that. I wonder about the Biden agenda, the infrastructure bill that's reached his desk. Has he signed that yet?
No, in fact, this is all part of, it's a great question you asked. Could have signed this at midnight or so on Friday. But that's something that nobody would have really had a chance to see or hear about. This White House is in communications mode right now, and they are planning apparently a ceremonial bill signing that'll happen in the light of day as the president prepares to do some traveling. He's got to hit the road to not only inform and remind people what happened Friday night, Matt, but also sell the second phase of this thing, the president's social spending plan, the reconciliation plan. That'll begin tomorrow with a trip to Baltimore, as the president will trump the $17 billion in that plan for port improvement and modernization. He'll be at the Port of Baltimore. I would expect a lot more travel from this president and his cabinet secretaries, making the case in the next week or so as to why the American people need these policies.
All right, Joe, thanks so much for joining us. Bloomberg's Joe Matthew there talking to us about what's going on in Washington. You can get the story from... Now, Bitcoin has jumped past $68,000 for the first time. Ether also hitting a record high. This is part of a wider rally in cryptocurrencies, $1 trillion. Eddie Vanderwalt from Bloomberg MLive joins us now. And Eddie, what's driving this rally? Is it inflation concerns?
Well, you know what? It's hard to make the case that this is purely inflation concern because statistically speaking, forget, this is part of the narrative. It doesn't matter that we can't see it in the data yet. What it is, it's a selling point for Bitcoin, right? When we talk, yes, I think that is part of it. I also think that we shouldn't discount Elon Musk's tweet over the weekend where he talked about selling some of his Tesla shares, some cryptocurrencies. But if we just look at what's happened in the space, you know, the overall market capitalization gain, a combination of factors. But it's just Bitcoin is back and it is buzzing again.
Well, Eddie, how broad is the participation? Because there have been studies that show that a very small group of investors, or is this Elon Musk's 5 followers that are all going in hardcore out of this speculation on speculation?
Look, I think a year ago you asked me that question. I said, look, the risk of contagion from Bitcoin and from cryptocurrencies more broadly is minimal. I think that has changed, right? Because I think the fact that we have ETFs that are available globally, and we're talking about, you know, the Fed and others talking about the risks from stable coins. There is real risk from contagion from Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies more broadly if we see volatility pick up, as it almost...
His work and the work of his teammates by typing MLIVGO on your Bloomberg terminal. Now, today marks 1 year since Pfizer's breakthrough COVID-19 vaccine. It's an anniversary to be celebrated, but the rapid spread of the Delta variant means the recovery from the pandemic could still be a ways off. This as we open the board, Sam Fazeli. So, Sam, you know, it was an amazing job. So fast, aren't going to help us to bring this pandemic to an end quickly, are they?
Matt, thanks for having me back on again. And I'm sorry about the not giant headphones, but I'll try and fix that. Look, to stop this infection, actually infecting such as people like myself who had a vaccine, you're going to have to separate people. It is pretty much impossible with the current products that we have, even the pills, etc., to stop the virus completely infecting people because it infects here and unprotected here. So that's where we are. With a booster, I'll have a higher level of protection for a while, but as the antibodies wane, my risk goes up again. So we just can't fight this virus in terms of infection rates with vaccines or drugs, etc., etc. We can, and we are, making cases.
You're looking fine, Sam, and we're glad that you're feeling better. Are we wrong to focus on infection data at all then now, Sam? I mean, clearly it matters in certain places, but in places where we have high vaccination levels, should we really pay much attention to those infection levels?
Yeah, well, Anna, I think the UK has already done that by definition, by default, whatever. So if you look at the progress in the UK, we're vaccinating, we're giving people, it's better to keep the cases down. Just wear a mask in indoor public spaces, perhaps. But that's a really small price to pay if it helps bring down the infection rate. And the isolation that goes with it and the risk to the rest of the family, et cetera, we can't minimize that risk. But what we have to control that we can do apart from masking.
All right, Sam, thanks so much for joining us. Sam Fazeli there, Bloomberg Intelligence, marking the anniversary, the 1 year anniversary of the vaccine release. Since then, 7.4 billion doses have been given out. Let's take a look at some of the stocks that are pretty mind-blowing. PayPal is one that made a huge deal of a new Amazon agreement where its Venmo can be used for payments. Initially in the aftermarket, the shares jumped 6%. Well, now they're down 3.5% because of the forecast. So they only expect 18% growth this year compared to 20% previously, and now investors are selling the shares. AMC, unbelievable 1,000%, but it's down in the pre-market even after beating estimates for earnings in the third quarter. It's losing market share in the U.S. and the all-important U.S. market, and I think investors are focused on that. Finally, NVIDIA is one of the chip makers. There are a couple of others, AMD as well, that have been given a boost by analysts saying they're going to be playing a key role in the metaverse, Anna. So as you shift your life from the real world to your computer, you're going to be using more
there in person. I maybe could appear in your studio through the magic of the metaverse. I'm sure it's not magic, it's science. But anyway, we get the point. Interesting lending rate and all-time highs. We'll talk markets with Matthew Savary of BCA Research. Plus, tapping the oil reserve. One report today may determine the White House decision on a stockpile release. More on that soon. This is Bloomberg.
Engine number one was able to do on the Exxon fight. It opened a lot of people's eyes to, I guess, the power that smaller investors can have. And I'm curious as to how ships with other companies.
We founded the company in Engine number one on the idea that we take the data, not ratings and rankings of ESG of the past, but we actually take the environmental, the climate, the social, worker data, and we simply use it to look, whether you're a big institutional investor or you're a small retail investor, you own the company. You have a voice, you have a vote every year.
Yeah.
And so our approach is to use the vote and engage with these companies over time.
But that's always been the case. I mean, at least in theory.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze, ask a question, or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Some breaking news coming through from Sony confirming it will build a $7 billion chip plant in Japan with TSMC, and anybody following supply chain issues globally no doubt will focus on that. Noor Al-Ali of Bloomberg Markets Live joins us now. Noor, what's the dominating theme for markets for you today? Is it all around who's going to run the Fed? Is it all around whether Lael Brainard is a bit more dovish than Jerome Powell, and whether that's what the markets would trade on if she were appointed? Because stocks don't seem to be moving all that far.
Yeah, absolutely. And good morning, Anna. I mean, look, if you want to look at how the market is pricing the Fed action or the Fed news, look at treasuries. They rose, futures rose yesterday after the news that Bloomberg broke. And because, I mean, if you want to consider who Bernard is, she is a dove, she tends to support, which would tend to support, bonds, but would also weigh on the dollar. But also the other problem to keep in mind as well is that she's quite pro. We're not really paying attention to anything aside from there's no alternative. And, it's all rosy and beautiful in the stock district at the moment.
I wonder, when you look at the moves that we've seen in bonds, does it make sense to you, especially after the jobs number that we had on Friday, if we get big PPI and CPI numbers tomorrow and Wednesday, does it make sense that we see investors continue to buy bonds here, pushing yields down?
There's two schools of thought here, and this is a great question because, the flattening that I see at the moment, or the one that I saw at least last week, was a little bit confusing to me because I would expect some kind of stability in the markets because this is an economy that's starting to recover. This is what you would expect from an economy that's really struggled in the last 2 years at least because of COVID, and that ebb and flow of COVID and supply chain bottlenecks really start to ease in. So now we're starting to see, and I'm going to give you an example here. If you look at the third quarter earnings, you really started seeing some data to suggest we did struggle because of Delta, but we're doing okay because most of the outlook from these companies throughout the board has been a lot more positive than you would expect. So, ahead of the CPI.
Noor Al-Ali. And for more market analysis, check out MLIV Go on your terminal. This is Bloomberg.
The energy crisis, there's a lack of drivers. Is there anything that you need to ask authorities to do better or that your clients want, the UK?
A reflection of this transition out of the pandemic. There are supply chain issues. Some of this stuff is transitory. There are some secular trends that we have to watch closely, but I think we're adjusting and dealing with it as anybody else is. And I think leaders here are thinking about it the same way leaders are around the world.
When you look at the UK and, of course, some of these green investments that the UK and the City of London particularly has been really trying to pitch, you've been extremely involved in carbon offsetting. Can London...
Private sector to try to get capital directed toward innovation in a way that we can accelerate the climate transition. And I want to emphasize it's clearly a transition.
Access the financial world on demand. Via live and on-demand webinars. Only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Let's get your first word late Monday. Completing 199 days in space, the space agency was forced to alter its cruise launch and landing schedule due to disruptive weather over the past 2 weeks. More on the markets next. This is Bloomberg.